how did we get here? God's people demanding a king. Judges who got their gigs because of who they know, openly taking bribes while the people openly lose faith in them. Justice perverted. Our trusted leaders, older by the day. Maybe they've got a little more left to give, but who can say just how much? And yet there Samuel is, giving it his all for as long as he can, all but begging the Israelites, for the literal love of God, do not go down this road. Here's what lies down that road. And it's not some mystical prediction, a message cloaked in symbols. It's a list of what despots do, what they want to do. These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you, he says. He will take your sons to grow his armies, who will then seize control of our industries. He will take your daughters for forced labor. He will take the best of everything and give it to his friends and cronies, and we will all be working for his comfort and glory. But the Israelites, they don't listen. They don't want to listen. They showed up to this conversation already decided, already committed to choosing kingship, determined. And what do they say their reasons are? They give three. One, so that we may also be like other nations. Two, so that our king may govern us. And three, so that he will go out before us and fight our battles. For these three reasons, they willingly trade liberty for safety. And though God clearly considers the embrace of a king to be the equivalent to a rejection of the Lord, God allows it. So how did we get here? I want to back us up a little bit and go through some of the history that precedes this moment, because I think it's important. I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning. I think we have a general sense of Genesis and Exodus. But for some of us, the timeline after they get to the promised land gets slightly muddled. So buckle up. We're about to blast through a few centuries of history according to the Bible. Now we know that Moses leads the Israelites through the wilderness and to the promised land. We also know that he himself is not permitted to enter. So when they all reach the land of Canaan, Moses stays back and hands leadership to Joshua. The book of Joshua then becomes a conquest narrative in which the Israelites invade and take over the whole region. And this is kind of where the Battle of Jericho fits in. Now, in keeping with the triumphant spirit of conquest narratives, the book of Joshua ends with the claim that the whole land had been conquered or given by God. But the next book, Judges, opens on a different scene. In Judges, the Canaanites, and this is the Bible's catch-all term for the indigenous peoples who were there, the Canaanites have not all been driven from the area. Chapter 1 of Judges ends with a list of places where they stayed and lived amongst the Israelites, kind of blending cultures. And then an angel of the Lord berates the Israelites for making a covenant with the Canaanites and failing to tear down their altars. Now God says that he will make the remaining foreigners into adversaries. Here we're getting sort of a cosmic reasoning for an era of unrest. And Joshua himself dies early in the book of Judges, second chapter. And the text says that the next generation does not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. They are highly susceptible to idolatry, which is both a betrayal of their covenant with the Lord and sort of a stand-in for losing their particular identity. This is the setup for Judges, a people first united by their own oppression, then escape, then war and conquest, who finally emerge victorious and find themselves asking that old familiar question, now what? With the huge amount of land they've acquired, even accounting for the areas they didn't 100% take over, the tribes finally have enough room to spread out and develop their own identities and cultures. It's time for them to figure out how to be a nation at peace. Sort of. Like I said, God is not pleased at their propensity towards idolatry and promises to raise up adversaries against Israel as punishment. The majority of Judges, which covers about 400 years, ends up being this kind of narrative spiral. There's a cycle that runs through the whole book over and over again, repeating, but also building towards a pretty terrible conclusion. Now, here's what the cycle is. Israel is at peace. Israel drifts towards idolatry. God gets angry. God enables enemies, often outside, to attack and threaten Israel. But at the same time, God also raises up a judge from among the people. A sort of hybrid role that combines the prophet, the warrior, and a civil leader. They speak truth on behalf of the Lord, calling Israel back to their covenant, while also strategizing the defeat of their enemies. They're also sometimes called upon to settle civic disputes, like how we consider judges in our current system. Then the enemies are defeated, Israel returns to peace for X number of years, and that judge eventually dies. 400 years of this. Each judge has sort of their own little chapter, so to speak. Probably the best known in here is Samson, right? The guy who was so strong until Delilah cut off his hair. But he's the last of 12 described in the book. They're interesting characters, certainly far from perfect, but always emerging from unremarkable places to help get Israel back on track. And when the job's done, they usually step away. In the case of one judge, Gideon, Israel actually asked him to stay and become a king, but he nobly refuses. But that's not the only time that Israel considers a king in this period. There's a guy, Abimelech. He's not a judge, but he's someone with aspirations towards power. He attempts to establish a monarchy. In grim fashion, however, he inaugurates his campaign by killing 69 of his 70 brothers. Not a good move, and his violent rule only lasts about 3 years before folks begin avenging those very murders. And he's finally killed when a woman drops a millstone on his head. And speaking of women, we cannot forget Deborah, the fourth judge, raised up by God. She is specifically identified as a prophetess and distinguishes herself as a military leader with impeccable strategy. The invading commander whom she defeats on the battlefield is eventually killed by another civilian woman, this time with a tent stake to the temple. Turbulent times. But it's also in this stretch of time that we find the story of Ruth, right? We know that story, sort of? Ruth is a daughter-in-law to Naomi, and when all the men and their family pass, leaving both Naomi and Ruth as widows, Ruth stays. She's given permission to leave, released from her obligations, but she stays. Together, and with great love for one another, Naomi and Ruth, two women in a highly vulnerable social position, they figure out a way to take care of each other, establish safety, and continue the family line. Now, our modern sensibilities might tell us that Ruth getting married is not the highest priority, but to understand it from an ancient Jewish perspective, the future of the family line is the future of the nation. This is two women figuring out what to do when the men are lost to death. Amid endless cycles of war, I suspect they were not the only women who had to. Now, in our Bibles, the book of Ruth comes after the book of Judges, but the story takes place kind of in the middle. It's a vignette from this time, a glimpse into what besides war was going on. But Judges itself has a much nastier end. After the death of Samson, we enter an extended period where God does not raise up a judge. In these last few chapters, we start to see this phrase every few paragraphs. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. It's a touchstone to which the author brings us back over and over again as we hear how Israel spirals into civil war. The details are a bit grisly for us, a bit grisly for brunch. So I won't get too far into it, but it is important to know that the event that triggers the final descent into civil war is the assault and murder of a vulnerable woman at the hands of one of the 12 tribes, the Benjaminites. And when news of this atrocity reaches the other tribes, they unite to punish them and attempt some modicum of justice. But it's not God's justice, and the casualties are very high. And considering that part of how they finally establish peace with the Benjaminites involves allowing them to abduct hundreds of women as wives, I think it's safe to conclude that the deeper moral lesson of caring for the vulnerable and the stranger was not totally internalized at this point. Now, all of this brings us to the beginning of 1 Samuel. Centuries of cycles of violence, Israel defending itself from outsiders, capped with civil war, Israel defending itself from within. Eli, already an old man by the time we meet him, is judge. Samuel, a young boy, and one of the Bible's many unlikely births, is given to Eli's care to be raised as a priest. Eli had made his older biological sons judges as well. This is the first we hear of the role of judges being passed down through families dynastically. But the text calls them scoundrels and tells of them using their office to extort and skim off the best parts of the sacrifices offered to God. Those sons die in battle against the Philistines, who are an increasing threat. Eli dies in an accident. Samuel is made judge, and as the story goes, he is great at it. Decades of peace. He's respected by the community he serves. He's constantly touring the tribes to see what things look like on the ground level. The Lord keeps the enemies at bay. The Israelites steer clear of idols, and everything seems to be working the way God intended it. But as we all do, Samuel grows old. And for some reason, perhaps a failure of his imagination, he ignores the lesson from Eli and appoints his own sons as judges. And they're not great. This is where today's reading picks up. Justice perverted, judges on the take, more Philistines at the gate with every passing year, trusted leaders aging out. Israel demands a king. In a way, I get it. I don't agree with it. It's definitely not God's plan for us. But I get it. What were their reasons again? One, so that we may also be like other nations. Yeah, I hear that. After generations and generations of turmoil, of turning back invaders, of constantly being confronted with the fear and intimidation that ruthless military efficiency can inspire in its targets. After all that, I can see how the Israelites' own particularity in culture and structure, the insistence on not assimilating, the humility of such strong emphasis on hospitality, I can see how that might start to feel like a vulnerability. How come no one else is going through this, they might ask. 2, so that our king may govern us. Yeah, that kind of top-down authority has a certain appeal. The author of the book of Judges certainly thought that a lack of king was to blame for that kind of moral relativism, the slippery slopes of self-interest that greased the wheels of civil war. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This isn't just decrying moral shifts. The chaos had a real human cost. And as always, it was heaviest on the backs of the most vulnerable. It's not so wrong to want to put an end to that. 3, so that he will go out and before us and fight our battles. A champion, a fighter, a strong man, our bully. Fight for us so that we don't have to. Strike fear in the hearts of our enemies. After getting so used to feeling perceived as weak, as an easy target, there is a certain catharsis to being seen as strong. I think it's a dangerous desire to indulge, but I do understand where it's coming from. Last week, we commemorated our Declaration of Independence. 248 years of these United States. 248 years since we said no to kings. Days before, we also watched our highest judges redefine the executive office, melting down generations of precedent to fashion something new. The president is now a king above the law. Is 248 years long enough to forget? Maybe. But I still think about the Israelites gathered up there at Ramah, Samuel's birthplace, his seat of power. When they asked for a king, how many of them were quietly remembering their history? How many were thinking about Pharaoh, about Abimelech? Were the stories of Deborah in jail and Ruth and Naomi and the unnamed woman who dropped a fateful millstone, were these unanimously celebrated? Or did some people think they were the wrong kinds of leaders? Careful who holds power. We don't want it in the wrong hands. Kritzman quipped to me, patriarchy doesn't like to be questioned. And the text presents the Israelites as unified, but how much dissent was there? Did families get together at Passover that year and awkwardly dance around the topic? Did someone's uncle have too much wine and start an argument they didn't need to? Was there a generational divide? Were they at each other's throats? You and I, all of us here, we are on our way to Ramah. We don't have a prophet with us, but we have plenty of brave truth tellers sounding the alarm. We have a detailed platform that describes everything a new king would do, like Samuel's warning on steroids. And we have stories from our past, our history, not just as a nation, but as a church. Samuel's voice echoing through the ages. So many voices, in fact. What will we do? Neither you nor I can answer that today. I wish I could, but I can't. But I do have a few pieces of good news. The first is that we are not yet at Ramah. We have some time, and there are conversations to be had, perhaps marches to attend, and certainly deliberations to be made. The second is that even when they make the absolutely wrong choice, God is still with Israel. When we have made the absolutely wrong choice, God has still been with us. Many things are being tested right now, but our covenant with God is not one of them. So let us walk with the Lord. Let us proclaim God's justice. Let us not be tempted by other people's ideas of power, but look to our scriptures and our history to discern what the Lord's idea of power is. Let us look for the leaders rising up from unlikely places. And above all, have faith, dear ones. Have faith.